SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the course in an Introduction to Disability Studies. Today we are going to discuss the relation of norms, normalcy, abnormality to disability. So before we get into the lecture number 3rd, Discourse of Norm, let's talk about what we discussed in the previous 2 lectures. The first lecture was about how to get into disability studies, what disability studies is about, why disability studies emerged, what are the research interest it has, and most importantly it also was looking about that how minority identity can be examined through disability studies. So as I am constantly making this point that disability studies is not only for people with disabilities or the concern associated with people with disabilities, but more about minority identity, whether you it's like gender or LGBT or let's say caste or any kind of minority culture. So disability studies directly connect and respond to the problems of minority identity. So this is what I was talking about in the lecture number 1, and when we came to lecture number 2, it was terms associated with disability studies, where I discussed how impairment, disability and handicap, they all are different terms and they are not supposed to be used synonymously, and also be looked at freak and also be examined stigma and creep. So all important terms that are associated, let's say for example deformity, disease, so on and so forth. So these are the terms which are associated with disability studies, and most often what I have noticed during my teaching career or when I was interacting with my students, I examined that most of the time these terms are used synonymously and they think that whether you use this or that. Let's say for example, I have also seen people using discrimination, marginalization, subjugation, exclusion as if they all are the same. And that is why the point what I made in the second lecture, that when we are writing thesis or when we are reading a book or when we are engaging with any kind of academic discourse, we are not supposed to take any particular term as if it is used apolitically, right? So, or let's say we are opening Oxford English Dictionary and we find the meaning and then we see, oh, this is what it means. No, when these particular terms associated with any particular discipline are used, they have a particular different meaning. So that is why when we are using, where we are using, in what context we are using, they are extremely significant and important for us to understand, right? So this is what I wanted to make this point in lecture number 2, and I also wanted to give you a sense that how we are going to look at certain terms, right? And in this lecture where we are entering into discourse and norms, like disability and norms, why I am giving one entire lecture on disability and norm? That's a one question that we need to ask, right? So the point is this, that if we understand what norms, how norms comes into the picture, what normalcy is all about, how a person is considered to be normal, or let's say for example what normality is. Once we understand this entire discourse around with norms, normalcy, normality, you will automatically understand that how they directly connect with disability. I mean, in this lecture, I am anyway going to talk about Michel Foucault and George Canguilhem and so on and so forth. But what I want to make you understand, like there is a book by Foucault called Abnormal. So if you see that this all book is about, not about abnormal, right? It's also about that how norm is constituted through abnormality. In the same way, disability is something that not emerge automatically. It is systematically constituted, constructed by political cultural discourses. and where norms play a very important role in constructing disability. So, if I have to say in one line that what norms and connection of disability is, I would say that if there is no discourse of norm, normal and normalcy, there won't be any discourse of disability or as a handicap, right. So, this is what the connection is about, and that is why we need to understand first what norms is about, and that is why this entire lecture is dedicated to discourse of norms. As we discussed in the previous lecture, that norms is something that is related to our political, cultural, social assumptions. So, for example, every one of us in a particular society and community, we have a particular assumption about us or about anything or about people, about body, how a body should look like, how a person should look like, how things should be, what a one person should do, what person should not do. So, these are the assumptions that we all have, and when a particular person do not adequate to that assumptions, when a person or a body fail to address that assumptions, or let us say for example, when a person is not able to meet that assumptions, that is where the idea of deviance or abnormalcy comes into the picture, right. So, the norms is nothing, as you see the slide number 1, as I have explicitly spoken about this. Look at the slide please. I start with the premise that the term or notion of norm, normal, normality or average made a relatively late appearance in the history of European languages. The word normal, defined as conforming to or not deviating from the common type or standard, regular or usual, only became part of the English lexicon around the year 1840, right. So, that is one, like why I am putting the first slide about the history of a particular word that comes into the picture in 1840, right. Why? Why 1840? That is the question. Why it was not in the English lexicon before? So, one idea is, as I was talking about, that every time society and culture evolves, it is not static, it keeps changing, and the moment it keeps changing, it keeps defining society, it keeps defining body. So, because of the intervention of medical institution, like slight industrialization and certain scientific intervention, people started thinking about how a body should look like, what a person should be. So, this is what this slide is about, that before 1840 there was no discourse of norm, normalcy, normality. Even if there was a discourse, it was quite invisible, it was not very prominent, but the first time in the English lexicon this word came into the picture, and that was the defining feature, right. That was a defining moment. After that, things started getting changed, which I will keep on talking about, that how in the modern time now the norm becomes so stringent. In fact, in this later part of lecture I am going to talk about it. So, one thing that we need to understand before I move further is this, that till 1814 the discourse of a norm was not discussed widely, it was not taken a space in academic discourse, right. So, this is one thing. Look at the point number 2, abnormality is not a simple fact or mere behavior. It is a qualification conferred upon certain individuals or groups who thus find themselves situated on the margin of normality, from which they are distinguished by certain traits, behavior or characteristics. Like this is a quote which I took from The Birth of a Clinic of Michel Foucault. So, what this is talking about, right, what this definition is talking about. This definition, you see, the moment first I talked about the idea of a norm and normalcy, and the second point I am talking about abnormality. Why? Because, as I said, norm cannot exist without the discourse of abnormality. It has to speak about abnormality first, then only norms comes into the picture. I am sorry if you have read the French Fanon. Anyway, I am going to talk about Frantz Fanon as well, but the point what I am making that because he specifically talks about that like colonizer cannot exist without the colonized people, right. In the same discourse which we borrow from Hegel, where he says that the relationship of master and slave are mutually dependent, right. It is more about the slave, like slave has to exist there for a master to exist. So, if there is no slave, there cannot be the discourse of a master. So, the point what I am making is here that we need to understand deeply the discourse of normalcy and abnormality to understand disability, and that is why Foucault, like a thinker, constantly speak about that how abnormality was created. So, abnormality is not something comes out of a blue moon, right. How does it come into the existence? Let us say for example, if you go and open any medical discourse, they have not defined anywhere what do they mean by a healthy body, right. How a healthy body look like, they do not talk about it, but rather what they talk about is that how a diseased body is, what a definition of diseased body is, how an unhealthy body look like. So, the moment you talk about unhealthy body, you are actually talking more about how a healthy body should look like, right. So, the point is this, that certain traits, certain characteristics are conferred upon a particular body or particular section of the body, a particular form of a body, and then they say that this is not acceptable. This is not what is desirable, right. Norm is more about desiring, because norm constantly, the moment you reach to that stage, it goes to another level. So, norm is something where is it like you desire for, right, you want to look like you want to be seen like this, but it is constantly elusive. Anyway, when I will come to like some more get into the theoretical discourse of Freud and Lacan, but for a moment what we need to understand that there are certain physical traits and attributes are conferred upon you. Let me make it more clear. Let us say for example, when you go to a restaurant or when you go to a particular sophisticated places so called, what happens? You know that a particular form of behavior are accepted and expected from the people from you, right. And if you deviate, if you do not do, obviously you look down upon, you are treated as if you do not belong to the society, right. So, the point is this, that it is more not about it is not more about the body, it is more about certain forms in which you have to fit in, right. So, as I made this pretty clear that certain physical traits, like you should not behave like this, you should not do something like this, you should not look like this, which I was talking more in the last lecture about deformity, right. That in certain culture, a certain kind of a body is considered to be abnormal or deviant, but they fail to understand that this is what the culture is about. Like every culture is different, but as I was also talking about that there is a pressure on all of us of homogenization and hegemonization, right. So, which is what Foucault is talking in The Birth of a Clinic. If you please get time, do read it, that how a certain characteristics, certain traits, certain behavior, certain attributes are conferred upon you, are associated and expected from you that you are going to do something like this. So, it is not that we are born with those attributes or those characteristics or those features, but rather in a particular society. Again, when I am saying in a particular society, there is a huge possibility that when you move to the another culture or another society, people are expecting another form of a behavior from you, and if you do not behave in certain way that is expected in that particular culture, you will be considered as abnormal. So, this is what everyone should understand, that every culture has its own norms, right. Saying that there is no norms in any culture, no, that is not true. Every culture has a particular norms and assumptions, and it has association that what kind of a body you should have, right. So, every culture has the idea of a deviant and abnormalcy. So, therefore, we need to understand that this is why it is important that what kind of a culture we are reading, what kind of a body are we going to studying, and what kind of attributes are assigned to a particular body, and that is very important when we are entering into or engaging with the discourse of disability studies. Moving to the point number 3 is norms are unwritten laws of a culture. That's a very, very important point, right? This is what Leonard J. Davis is talking about in the book Enforcing Normalcy, Disability, Deafness and Body. So what he says that norms are the unwritten laws of a culture. They represent the boundaries of what is considered acceptable behavior. Understand this. This is not, he's saying, natural, right, or what you learnt the moment you got birth. It's something acceptable, right? It's like unwritten laws of a culture. And the second point what he's making is that acceptable behavior, right? The boundaries, right? This is, let's say for boundaries, if you are not some here and here and here or here, this will fall under the category of abnormal, right? So what is acceptable behavior? Norms are enforced. Look at the second point. Enforced. It's not that if you deviate, it will be ignored. No, it is enforced from subtle social cues to explicit regulations. However, what is deemed normal is often arbitrary and can be exclusionary. I'll explain to you what I mean by arbitrary and exclusionary, particularly for those who deviate from the norm. In the context of disability, norms play a significant role in shaping perception, attitudes and treatment of individuals. Challenging normative standard is essential for promoting inclusivity and dismantling barrier to equality, right. So, as I was talking in the previous lectures, in the lecture number 1, where I was talking about what disability studies is about, in that lecture what we noticed significantly that this lecture is more this lecture was more about that disability studies emerged because it talks about inclusion. It talks about bringing people into the mainstream, right. And so here also what Leonard J. Davis is saying, that as an individual it's our responsibility to question the norms, because until and unless we question the norms, the inclusivity cannot be promoted. Now the question comes here, why do we need to question the norms? He himself says in the same quote which I was talking about, that because there is a boundaries, right, created by the societies, and it forces you to comply with those unwritten laws, right. So it's like, it's not like you go into a classroom where you get a book and you read that, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do, this is what I'm not supposed to do. But rather what happens when you are growing in a particular society, there are people, there is a society who is watching you, and the moment you deviate, you do something which is not acceptable, you are told, right. It's like you don't know, you have no idea why did you do that, but you do, you commit a crime, right, in terms of norms, and then you are told this is not what is acceptable, you are not supposed to do that. And then from that onwards you see that society is ostracizing you, it's not rewarding you, you are not being accepted, inclusion is not being promoted, you are being excluded because of your unacceptable behavior, and that is moment you stop doing this. Obviously it is a coercive, right, it's extremely coercive, because everyone has a different desires, everyone looks differently, everyone's behavior is different, but the point is that it is imposed on us by society, by people, right. In fact, if you read Frederick Jameson's, he also talks about, or Frederick Engels, he also talks about that how the origin of the family, I mean he talks more about the family, but what I am talking about here is this, that even a family become one kind of institutions that teaches you that how you should grow, what you should do, what you should not do, right. So this is why what I was talking about, that something is a normal is not anywhere, it's not anywhere. So what do you mean by arbitrary is that there is no normal connection, it's like there is no natural connection of your behavior and being something normal, but rather it's a society decides, a society that functions in certain way, and it's arbitrary because the moment you move to another culture, another society, and if you are like behaving in the same way, suddenly you are being interrupted by saying that this is not what acceptable, this is not what is expected from you, and then what do? You change your behavior, right? So that is what is arbitrary. So what is considered a normal in one particular society is not normal in another society, and therefore there is no connection between these two, and that is why Leonard J. Davis is saying that this is arbitrary and exclusionary. Why does he say exclusionary? That's the second point he makes. He says it's exclusionary because you are accepted in a society provided on the condition, right, that you prescribe to those behaviors, you prescribe to those assumptions, you start working on those standards, rule unwritten given to you by the society, and that is why it is called exclusionary, right, because it is enforced upon you and it does not let you do what you want, and it challenges. There is a condition of being accepted in the society. So this is what connection, like Leonard J. Davis beautifully explained in this extensive quote, that what is a norm and how it is related to us, right. So it's also my request that it's an extremely significant and important book. Please do read it if you really want to understand what disability studies is about, or more importantly what minority identity is about and how norms are connected or related to body. So moving to the second slide, normality is a privileged, it is strikingly vacant and difficult to define category which gains its existence and status from its relationship to the constitutive disavowal of abnormality. This is basically a quote by Treman, Campbell and Sheldrick, and as Tom Shakespeare put it, disability functions as a dustbin for disavowal for the category of normality, right. So now you see, this is a very extremely significant explanation given by what disability is, right. I have been talking about some other definition as social model or what is accepted by WHO or how it is defined, but it goes more further, right. When we are coming to the norms, what happens? Anything that is disavowal, right, which means that this is not accepted, this is all sent back to disability, right. So, and like that's why he says that, look at this side, dustbin for disavowal, that's a very important term, right, dustbin for disavowal. So dustbin basically means that what happens, like look at your house, what happens, you want your house to be very neat and clean, and anything that is not acceptable, anything that you think is not looking good to me, or even this is not very pleasant to you. So what do? You pick that stuff from your house and put into the dustbin, you throw it, right, you keep it outside. This is what like Tom Shakespeare, Treman and Sheldrick is saying. What are they saying? They're saying that disability is a kind of a dustbin, some metaphorically being used, that whatever not is accepted in the society in terms of body, in terms of behavior, they all relate it to disability, right. So this is extremely very significant example is brought by Sheldrick and Treman and all. So moving to the second point on your slide, please look at it. The notion of the norm in contrast to an ideal suggests that the majority of the population is expected to align with it in some way. It defines the typical characteristics or behavior exhibited by majority of individuals falling within the central range of well-shaped curve. In any well curve, there will inevitably be characteristics that diverge from the norm at its extremes. Therefore, when considering the concept of a norm in society, it inherently brings forth the idea of deviations or extremes. In such a society, individuals with disability may be perceived as deviating from the norm. For instance, in a culture where physical fitness is highly valued and considered the norm, individuals with mobility impairments might be viewed as deviating from this standard. They may encounter barriers to participation in activities or face a stigma due to their differences. Similarly, in societies where cognitive abilities are highly prized, individuals with intellectual disability might be marginalized or excluded from certain opportunities based on their perceived deviation from the norm, right. So, obviously, the lecture number 4, which you will see, I will be talking about disability and stigma. So, I will not explain much in this lecture, but what I am going to talk, what I am going to explain you for a moment, that how deviation emerges, right. So, let us say, for example, let me give you an example. See, I would say that imagine a hearing impairment person who cannot hear, but they speak to each other, which means to say in the same community who are hearing impaired person, they speak to each other with sign language, right. They communicate through the sign language. Imagine a person who does not know sign language, right, and he is going to stay or live with those community where only sign language is the medium to communicate. Imagine what would happen, right. The condition would be this, that the person who does not know sign language, he will feel disabled, he will feel deviated from the norm. The reason is that because he does not know the sign language, but the same person who was feeling abled, or let us say not disabled, or who was feeling that he is so called normal, is now feeling abnormal or deviated from the norm, or let us say, for example, disabled, right. So, the point what I am making with these examples is that deviation is something very normal or natural in a particular society, which means to say that there is no society from which you cannot deviate, from which that there is always a standard of the society. But now you will ask me a question, in that way then you will say that then every time some way or other way people will be excluded, if not disabled people then someone else or something whatever. Yes, that is very true, but the point what I am making is that why we are engaging with disability studies? We are engaging with disability studies because that this idea of norm, this idea of normalcy, or the society's standard or expected behavior can be stretched so that everyone can be included. Obviously, that will be a very ideal expectation to live in an ideal society where there won't be any idea of a deviation, there won't be any idea of a normal or abnormal, so on and so forth. But what my stand is today is that I want to push the boundaries of a society where maximum people, like the norms, the boundaries of norms, where maximum people can be incorporated and they can be accepted. So, this is what I am standing today and speaking to you, so that you can also think a other way, but that kind of perspective will make a society better and will promote inclusion, which is really needed in our society. All right. So, let us move to the slide number 3, where I am talking about Francis Galton, and it's a very important and significant person, because after Francis Galton things changed completely, or I would say the very idea of eugenics, right, the very idea of eugenics drastically transformed the very idea of norms and normalcy. I mean, this idea emerged in 19th century, and obviously because of the scientific development, what was happening, that people were coming and they were started talking about who are racially inferior, who are racially superior. And then there was a time in this experiment, they came to conclusion that a particular form of a body is inferior and a particular form of a body is superior. Obviously, they put white race superior than to the black, right. So, and obviously they were very statistically they were talking in a lot of numbers, and that created a society where disabled people are not accepted, right. So, I will talk in details, but let us go to the slide and read first what Francis Galton is talking about. Look at the slide. Francis Galton, a prominent Victorian scientist, and he was a cousin of Charles Darwin. I am sure that you all know his book called Origin of the Species, right. And for me, what was a very important, his book, The Descent of Man, right. So, for me, more than Origin of the Species, obviously this is a very landmark book, but I also ask my students and fellow friends to read The Descent of Man. This is a very significant book and very important, right. So, Francis Galton, who is considered to be the cousin of Charles Darwin, he played a very significant role in shaping the concept of the norm through his work on eugenics. Galton was deeply interested in understanding human variation and believed that certain traits such as intelligence and moral character were hereditary. That is a problem. It starts with, because the moment you start saying that intelligence and morality are hereditary, he coined the term eugenics in the later 19th century, advocating for practices that aim to improve the genetic quality of human population by promoting the reproduction of those deemed to have a desirable traits, while discouraging or preventing those with undesirable traits from reproducing. So, Galton's work laid the foundation for the construction of the norm by establishing a framework for measuring and categorizing human characteristics. He developed statistical methods to analyze large data sets, including the use of well curve to represent distribution of traits within a population. Galton argued that majority of individuals who cluster around the average or norm, who deviations from this average representing variation in traits. Eugenicists, influenced by Galton's ideas, took this concept of the norm further by applying it to the social policies and practices. They believed that by identifying and promoting the traits associated with the norm, such as intelligence, physical health and moral uprightness, they could improve society as a whole. This often led to discriminatory practices targeting marginalized groups such as people with disabilities, immigrants and ethnic minorities who were deemed to deviate from the norm. So, for example, eugenic policies implemented in various countries in the early 20th century included forced sterilization laws targeting individuals deemed unfit or feeble-minded, as well as restrictions on immigration based on racial or ethnic criteria. These policies were justified on the grounds of promoting the welfare and progress of society by eliminating perceived threats to the genetic quality of the population. However, eugenicist ideas and practices were deeply flawed and morally reprehensible. They were based on the flawed assumption about genetic and human traits, as well as fueled by, most importantly, prejudice and discrimination. The construction of the norm in this context served to reinforce existing power structure and perpetuate injustice, rather than promoting genuine progress or well-being. Galton and eugenicists played a significant role in constructing the idea for the norm by developing statistical methods to analyze human variation and promoting the idea of promoting certain traits as desirable. However, their application of these concepts to social policies resulted in harmful practices that targeted marginalized groups and perpetuated discrimination. Right. So, this is a significant point we are making. Right. Let me talk what resulted because of the eugenicist. After my reading of the World War, Second World War and First World War, I came to a conclusion that somewhere or the other way, eugenicists were also responsible for fueling the massive decapitation of disabled people, right? Because Hitler or Nazis believed that these bodies are inferior, they don't have right to live in a society, and if they live, they are going to reproduce a kind of generations or people who will be burden on our society because they are intellectually and also racially not superior. So, that is a problem of eugenicist which created. As I also made the second point, that because of the eugenics, it resulted in that maximum policies were framed which discriminated certain section of the society and people, because as I also made this point, because that it was based on prejudices and social biasness. This entire experiments, this entire scientific adventure was not based on scientificity, but rather it was more that what you believe, what you assume, what you think was materialized, translated into a scientific experimentations, right. It was not questioned, but rather accepted by the people because it was named as a scientific experiment. People later on realized that it's a more what people believe in, it is imposed on them, right. So that's a problem we need to understand, that most of the time even the science, I say it's not a science, right. What I mean to say that the scientificity of the science also need to be questioned. Eugenism is one example. I can give you many more examples, experiment done in this name of the science and created a lot of havoc for the society, and later on obviously once the damage is done, it cannot be recuperated. The only thing is that it can be ameliorated, or it can be just improved later on, so that this damage will not happen in the later future or on the later generations. But the point is this, even the there is a book by Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and there he also speak about that how the experiment of science is extremely biased. However, I am not going to question what science does, but what I am talking about that how eugenics created a lot of problems for disabled and other minor identities, right. So keeping in this mind, you have to trace the history, that how slowly and gradually certain assumptions or behavior was imposed on disabled people and was expected that they should behave, otherwise they will be discriminated or ostracized from the society, right. So moving this, let us move to the next slide, which is talking about how language also helps in establishing norms. So read the slides now. Language helps establish social scripts and expectations for behavior within various contexts. Through language, individuals learn what is considered appropriate. Look at this, appropriate, considered or expected in different situations, reinforcing the norms of society. For instance, language may dictate how individuals greet each other, they express gratitude, negotiate social hierarchies, thereby reinforcing cultural norms and values. Along with the language, society and culture also play a crucial role in constructing the idea of norms, shaping what is considered typical or acceptable behavior within a given context. These norms can vary widely across different cultures and communities, reflecting the values, beliefs and social expectations prevalent within them. So, as I have already explained this to you, but what I mean by these slides is that through language also norms is permeated. For example, let us say that there is a way of a greeting in a particular society, right, and even if you have a respect, right, I keep on saying this, that until and unless you perform, I mean when I will come to the butler, I will speak more about it, until and unless you perform that prescribed behavior, you will not be considered polite. How do you know someone is polite or impolite, right? You do not go into the heart of a person and know that, oh, he is so polite or he is not polite, but how do you know? You look at his behavior, you see that whether this particular person is behaving according to the particular rules which is prescribed by a particular society. If yes, if he performs accordingly, or if he meets to that expectations, then you say yes, he is a very polite, right. So, the idea of being polite, idea of being normal, idea of being good citizen, idea of being nice man depends, or let us say nice women, right, that is more important, is more about a kind of society you are living in, and in addition to that, whether you are able to perform those given unwritten laws, what Davis says. All right. So, let us look at some examples. We will quickly move to that. Look at some example on your slides. Gender norms. Many societies have specific norms regarding gender roles and behaviors. For example, in some culture, there are expectations for men to be assertive, strong and primary breadwinners. Right? This is a norms, gender, in terms of gender. I am just explaining to you so that you can understand what I mean by norm through examples. While women are expected to be nurturing, gentle, focused on domestic duties, these norms influence various aspects of life, including family dynamics, career choices and social interactions. Right? So, I am sure that you have been encountering in your everyday life, and you see that the way men behave, women do not behave in the same way. It is not because women cannot behave or women are born with those behaviors. No, it is because slowly, gradually, systematically, through the institutionalized behavior or patterns, and also because of the culture and society, it is told, given to us that how a man should behave or how women should behave, right. So, it is generally said, like, let us say, I am sure that you know this, I do not want to explain it much, but just one quick example, that if a man do not earn, right, if he is not a breadwinner, you see how he is looked at the society, and if a woman is not taking care of the family, is how she is looked, obviously looked down, right, by the society. So, this is not something one is born with, but this is something you see, it is noticeable because of rules, prescriptions of the society, right. So, this is called gender norms. Moving to the second, social etiquettes, like norms surrounding social interaction and etiquette dictate appropriate behavior in different contexts. For examples, norms around greetings such as shaking hands or bowing vary across cultures. Similarly, norms regarding personal space and eye contact can differ significantly between cultures, influencing how people engage with one another. Then we have body image norms. Culture norms also shape perception of beauty and body image. For example, in Western society, there may be pressure to conform to a thin ideal for women and muscular ideal for men as portrayed in media and advertising. In contrast, in other culture, different body types, this is what I have been talking about, right. Every society expects a different body from its members, right. Okay. So, religious norms, religious belief and practices often establish norms governing morality, behavior, social interaction within a community. For example, dietary restrictions, you do not eat non-veg on a particular day, dress code, like how do you dress in a particular religion, like when you are going to perform a particular puja or religious rites, and norms around interpersonal relationship may be influenced by religious teaching and training. And then we have workplace norms. Norms within professional setting dictate appropriate behavior and conduct in the workplace. This can include norms around punctuality, communication style and dress code. And I mean, I can tell you with my personal experience that most of the time when we are informal and we meet some professors, they judge me, they think that he is a very casual, right. So, I have this problem of people who judge a person because of a particular dress code, right. And most importantly, what happens most of the time, that because of your dress code, you will be judged whether you are a good scholar or bad scholar, whether you are good for this profession or not good for this profession, right. So, this is what is a workplace norms, right. So, I personally have been most of the time interrupted by many people, but I have my own way of looking at it, thinking. But the moment you go to the Western universities, let us say any particular university, you name Oxford, Harvard, I have been to these places and I have seen that they are very casual about being dress code, right. I am not saying that you should not follow the dress code, but I am saying that the argument what I am making is that how the particular norms are associated with particular dress code, right. So, this is what the point I am making. Let us move further. Then we have a family norms. So, family structures and dynamics are shaped by cultural norms and expectations. Norms regarding marriage, child rearing practices, intergenerational relationship, can vary significantly across culture. For example, some culture prioritize collectivism and interdependence within extended family network, while other emphasize individualism and nuclear family units, right. I mean, I want to hold on for a second just to explain to you that when I went to US, what was happening for a particular time period when I was interacting with my friends and students, I realized that how they think. Let me give you an example, right. In India, or most of, like, let's not say India because India is very diverse. Let's say, for example, in North Indian communities, mostly what happens, a girl is getting married to a man and then she switches to a man's family and she goes to a house where parents are also living, or may say the house is built by parents and the son is living over there, and the daughter-in-law will also go over there and she will stay for a particular time period, or if there is a job, she goes to somewhere else. If there is not a job, a person is living with a family, she will also live over there. When I spoke about this to my American friends, you will see they were shocked to believe that a girl is going to stay with father-in-law and mother-in-law. This is not acceptable. This is what the words you use. This is not acceptable. I cannot live with this. So I don't have a problem with this particular attitude and behavior. What I'm saying that they found our culture being abnormal, right. And for me also, oh really, I'm going to leave my parents when I'm getting married, I have to move to the new house where I and my wife only lives. So this is a kind of a shocking reflections on our culture, right. But what I mean to say that this is the family norms. Everywhere they have a different kind of a norms, right. Moving to the sexual norms, look at the slide please. Cultural norms also influence attitudes, behavior related to sexuality and relationship. These norms can encompass expectations around sexual orientation, gender identity, sexual expression and consent. For example, norms regarding premarital sex, same-sex relationship and contraception use can vary widely across culture and society. Forget about across culture and society, even in our culture, you see that initially there are a particular kind of a sexual behavior was not accepted, but later on you see that as a society is evolving, we are being more open and we are ready to accept that, right. So you see that even in the same culture, at one particular at one time, something which was not normal, abnormal, which was not acceptable, is now normal, and people are ready to accept that and they have absolutely no objection, right. So you see that, forget about the culture changing in different culture changing in norms changing in different culture. It is what we notice in the same, but in a same society as it evolves, there is another way of a normalcy or idea of a norm evolves, all right. So let's move to the next slide now. I will talk about certain thinkers who have extensively talked about this idea of norm, and this is what, let's look at the slide please. We have Erving Goffman. Erving Goffman, I would say that I'm just not naming the person, I am in fact requesting you all to read Erving Goffman extensively, as he is a very famous sociologist and he has contributed a lot in our disability studies, all right. So what is Erving Goffman is saying? Erving Goffman, as a dramatological approach to social interaction, highlights the role of norms in shaping everyday behavior. He argues that individuals engage in impression management, strategically presenting themselves in a ways that conform to societal norms and expectations. Goffman's concept of face work explore how individuals negotiate and maintain their social identities within various social contexts, often by adhering to or challenging prevailing norms. So I would request you that read Erving Goffman to understand him more better. There is another person called Habermas, and he is a very, very renowned and influential person, and his idea is that theory of communicative actions, right. He has written many good books on modernity, right, and I would request you to read this his books on modernity. But here what I am going to speak about it is his theory of a communicative action emphasizes the role of a language and discourse in the construction of a norms and formation of consensus within society. He distinguishes between instrumental rationality, which aims to achieve strategic goals, and communicative rationality, which involves mutual understanding and consensus building through dialogue. Habermas argues that democratic societies rely on communicative action to establish and legitimize norms through rational discourse and deliberation. So, these are the thinkers, I mean I just named two, there are many thinkers who have offered diverse perspectives on the discourse surrounding norms. They highlighting the complex interplay of power, language, social structure, individual agency in their construction and enforcement within society, right. So, I just named two people here, one is Habermas and second one is Goffman, and there are more people who have spoken about idea of norms and normalcy, like for better understanding, as I said, that you are going to start with Leonard J. Davis, and he is a very very active speaking about disability and so on, and so, like norms, abnormalcy, and obviously do read Foucault. Without reading Foucault, I am pretty sure that it is very difficult to understand the discourse of disability studies. But the point what I am making is this, that during the 17th century, as Habermas also speaks about, and that is why I suggested you to read his book on modernity, and obviously Max Weber, he also talks about rationality, instrumental, bureaucratic thinking practices, because they all talk about what kind of stringent society we have. So, the argument what I am making is that as the rationality started emerging, right, so everything was being controlled by mind. So, what is a logical? Everything needs to be justified, everything needs to be rationalized. If something you see that not appropriate, not acceptable, not going good, not on the basis of what your emotions, empathy and sympathy speak about, but rather what your mind is advocating for, what rationality advocates for. If that is not working, if that is not taking place, then it is not acceptable. So, the point what I am making, that after the age of enlightenment, right, which is a time when you see that people are switching. In fact, Descartes was extremely significant in making that move where he says that cogito ergo sum, right, I think therefore I am. So, here you see he is giving more importance to thinking being, right, which means to say rationality, and that is where body started taken back, right. People started pushing the discourse of a body differently, people started giving importance to the mind, and then we get the dualism called mind and body. And what happens in the in this duality, mind and body, obviously mind takes a superior position and body which is dependent on mind. So, what happens, why I am talking about this, what happens that if something is not logical, something is not rational, something is not appeals to my mind, not to the body, again understand this, then this is not acceptable, and that is where the problem is started. So, this being logical, it is not, I am not saying that one should not be rational, but I am saying that your rationality should have a limit which should not be coercive, which should not prescribe certain behavior on someone else, and that is what science also does, right, which I was trying to criticize science for a second, that science also does the same thing, right. It is also based on scientificity, which means to say that scientific thinking. What is the scientific thinking? Again, as I said, that there are people who keep talking about, like Thomas Kuhn, that there is a problem in scientific thinking. It is also based on biasness, it is also based on prejudices, it is also not very scientific, but it is called as being scientific, right. So what they do, they start relegating, they start scrutinizing a particular form of behavior or society or a body, and then what comes out is really bad, which means to say that certain people are extremely thrown in the margin and they are not part of society, and that is why inclusion is not promoted, but rather exclusion is being promoted. All right. So in conclusion, what I am trying to say here and suggest that we all need to understand the discourse of a norm more systematically to understand that how disability was perpetuated, how the discourse of disability was perpetuated negatively, not positively. All right. So read these people, think about it, so that when as I proceed further, we can engage with these thinkers, with these ideas and discourses more systematically. All right. So with this, I would like to end my lecture so that we can move in the next class and talk next is which is going to talk about stigma and disability. All right. So for time being, I'll take a break. See you in the next lecture. Thank you so much. Have a nice time and stay healthy. Bye bye.